You're traveling through another dimension, a dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. That's a signpost up ahead. Your next stop, the Twilight Zone. Doo 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 doo.
Dun, dun, dun. We're here.
Yes. And we are here to discuss one of our degree episodes, and this is all about Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone. And we invited Mark Dawidziak to come back with us. This is, I think, your third time to be on with us, maybe fourth,
Yep.
something like that, because he is a true expert on this subject.
Yes. He even wrote a book about it. Was it
Yes.
a book about Twilight Zone as a whole or Rod Serling and Twilight Zone?
It was a book about the Twilight Zone. It's called Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is basically 50 life lessons derived from the Twilight Zone.
Yes. And
Awesome.
it's amazing. It's really, really
Yes.
a cool book. So I
Yeah,
guess,
it fits perfectly.
yes. So where do you guys want to start tonight?
Well, why don't we start with the man behind the Twilight Zone, which is
All
Rod
right.
Serling. And for people who may not know him,
Mhm.
I don't know who wouldn't, considering anybody that has watched Twilight Zone knows a little bit about Rod Serling, but they may not know the man behind the Twilight Zone, if you know
Right.
what I mean.
Mhm.
So
Exactly.
let's start there. So go. Carmen, you want to kick it off?
Well, I can just I was going to say
Or
basic
Mark
facts.
can?
I
Yeah.
know he was born Christmas Day of 1924. He died June 28th, 1975.
Mhm.
And the Twilight Zone also ran from 1959 to 1964. And he was a paratrooper in World War II. So he, was in the military. He worked in radio, and he was one of the, I can't even describe the word I would want to use, one of the most incredible writers of TV shows, especially in the early days of TV. And so I say, Mark, you probably can add to what I'm saying
Well,
much better.
the interesting thing I think leading up to the Twilight Zone is that if you take Rod Serling's life and his resume and everything about him, there's nothing at all that's going to suggest that he's going to be best known for the Twilight Zone.
Interesting.
It's
Okay.
not like he is a guy who was out there. There were other writers who wrote for the Twilight Zone. Rod recruited some of the best fantasy writers out there, like Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont, to write for the
Mhm.
Twilight Zone. These guys were writing for the magazines of the 50s, the science fiction and horror magazines. They're the perfect writers, which is why Rod recruited them.
Mhm.
Rod didn't. And Rod's, his pattern up to that point is the fact that he is born Christmas Day, 1924. He liked to joke that he was the Christmas present that came unwrapped. Uh, he
That's
had
great.
he had a perfect childhood in many ways. He grew up in Binghamton, New York. He memorializes Binghamton in episodes of the Twilight Zone. He had this great nostalgia for this summers with bandstands and merry-go-rounds and
Mhm.
cotton candy and hot dogs. And this was his childhood. He really did. And on the day of graduation from Binghamton High School, he went down to the recruiting office. And World War II is going on. This is, the the middle of the war. This is 42.
Mhm.
And he talks himself not only into the army, he talks himself into the paratroopers. Now, he's underweight, he's undersized, he's too short. There's no way he should have talked his way into this, but he talks himself into doing a very dangerous job in a
Mhm.
very dangerous place because they sent him to the South Pacific.
Wow. Okay.
In the South Pacific, the paratroopers were basically being airdropped into the occupied islands in front of the expeditionary forces.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
So he sees a lot of his friends die. He's nearly killed on several occasions. And he comes back from the war wounded, both psychologically. Today, we would say he was probably suffering. Um, Back then, they called it shell shock. You know,
Yes.
Mhm.
today we understand it a lot more.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and he was also wounded physically. He took shrapnel in the wrist and the knee. He's got a knee that's going to go out for the rest of his life.
Okay.
When he plays too hard or plays tennis too hard or whatever.
Mhm.
So he doesn't know what to do. He decides to go to Antioch College in Ohio. And
Hmm.
the reason he goes to Antioch College is because his older brother had gone there, and he's thinking about majoring in physical education.
Okay.
He wants to work with kids. He thinks that would be a great way. But when he gets to Antioch, he discovers writing. And he discovers that writing is a cathartic way to work through his war experiences.
Hmm.
If it was not for the war and it's not for Antioch, we don't really get Rod Serling as a writer. These are the two things that sort of put him on the path.
Okay.
After graduation, he goes to work at Cincinnati radio and TV stations, and he starts to sell to the big live anthology shows back in New York. And he and Patty Chayefsky are probably the two leading playwrights, if you will, of early television. Rod
Hmm.
writes towering dramas that win him Emmys. He wins, several Emmys before the Twilight Zone even airs. He's considered, I think he's called the angry young man of television. He writes one called Patterns, which is about a businessman facing a moral dilemma. Requiem for a Heavyweight.
Hmm.
Now, so how do we get to the Twilight Zone is basically the question. Nothing I
Okay.
just told you suggests that here's a guy with a resume that is going to create one of the great fantasy, science fiction, horror anthologies of all time.
Very true.
What happens is that at the beginning of the 1950s, when Rod got into television, television was an infant medium. It was the Wild West, basically. They were making up the rules as they went along. By the end of the 50s, television was getting civilized. And it was nothing but rules. And Rod was writing very socially conscious dramas. Rod wrote about themes, issues, big things, bigotry, prejudice, war, how we treat the elderly, how we treat children. These were Rod's themes. And it was getting harder and harder to get the message across because now all of the executives were telling him, well, you can't say it that because these stations in this area of the country will get upset if you do that. You can't do that because the sponsor will get upset. You can't do that because the affiliate stations will get upset. You can't. Everything was being diluted, and it was getting to be very frustrating.
Hmm.
How do you get the message across? So Rod rolls the dice. He takes a gamble, and he decides that if he couches the messages in fantasy, he can write about the very same things that he's been writing about all along, the same things: war, prejudice, bigotry, hatred, all of that. And nobody will lift an eyebrow. Basically, if I put it on a rocket ship and send it to Alpha Centauri, nobody will care.
Right.
And that's exactly what happened. If you want to seek this out, there's a wonderful interview that he did with Mike Wallace, later of 60 Minutes fame.
Okay.
It's a live interview that they're both on camera. It's black and white, grainy black and white. You can see it on YouTube. They're both smoking like stacks during the
Yeah.
whole interview. And at one point in the interview, Mike Wallace asks Rod in his snarky Mike Wallace way.
Yeah.
He says, "Well, Rod, you're doing this thing called the Twilight Zone. I guess we can assume you're done with serious writing for a while." And the camera is on Rod. And Rod's got this smile like, the cat that just ate the canary. But the magician can't give away his trick. He can't
Right.
say what he's about to do. So what does he say? He says, "Yes, Mike, you're right. I'm done with serious writing." And then he goes on and does the most important thing he's ever going to do with his writing life. He
Hmm.
opens the door to the Twilight Zone. And he basically becomes what Mark Twain called a moralist in disguise.
Okay.
He,
Hmm.
Mark Twain used humor to disguise the moral.
Hmm.
Rod used fantasy to disguise the moral. But
Yeah.
he's writing about the same things. And this it changes television forever. It changes fantasy storytelling forever. Because 2 years after The Twilight Zone ends its run in 64, Star Trek starts.
Yes.
Hmm.
And Gene Roddenberry was very clear that he got the idea from Rod Serling. He got the idea. He was
Hmm.
inspired by Rod, that the whole idea is that if you put it on a starship and send it out, and it's about aliens and such, you can talk about whatever you want.
Yeah.
So the gamble paid off is basically it. But
Hmm.
the most important thing about the Twilight Zone is that every Twilight Zone, and this is how my book came about, every Twilight Zone is basically a morality tale.
Yes. Hmm.
Every single one is a parable, a life lesson, a morality tale.
Hmm.
And my Twilight Zone book came about when it's always been my favorite show of all time, ever since I was a little kid. It's always has been my favorite show, and I've written books about 3 TV shows. So I mean, to say this is my favorite is really saying something.
Yeah.
Um, and when my daughter turned 15, my daughter Becky, she loved classic television. Becky grew up loving classic television. She loved I Love Lucy and the Dick Van Dyke Show and the Andy Griffith Show, and
Mm.
and the joke around our show when Becky was small was this kid's going to be shocked to find out they're making TV in color these days. She lived in a black and white world.
Yeah.
But she did, and then when she would watch Columbo and the Night Stalker, and she was watching, she's still,
Yeah.
and she actually had watched Rod's later series, Night Gallery, which was the
Yeah.
horror series on NBC. She actually had watched that before she'd ever gotten to the Twilight Zone. But when she
Okay.
turned 15, I looked at her and said, "You have completed your undergraduate work in classic television. It is time you to start your postgraduate work. Get serious about this. It's time for you to enter the Twilight Zone."
Yes.
So we did a forced march through all 156 episodes. It took us about 4 months. We
Okay.
watched 1 or 2 episodes a night.
Yeah.
And we were in the first season. We were deep in the first season, and we were watching an episode called Escape Clause with David Wayne as a hypochondriac who
Yes.
makes a deal with the devil for immortality.
Hmm.
And there's an escape clause at any point he can summon the devil and surrender his soul.
Yeah.
And if you know anything about the Twilight Zone, you know this is not going to end well for David Wayne.
No, it does not. I've seen that
This,
one.
so, um, but when the episode was over and it had run its course, I jokingly turned to Becky and said, "You let that be a lesson to you. Always
Mhm.
read contracts carefully. Always look for loopholes. Don't sign anything without understanding the consequences." And I was kidding around. We were laughing.
Yeah.
Just thought about it for a second, and I thought, like, well, wait. Remember uh, all those contracts people signed in 2008, all those banking contracts and
Mhm.
you know, sub lending the crisis we got into. What if everybody actually had read those contracts and understood what they were signing? And,
Yeah.
so I kind of turned back to her and said, actually, I'm not kidding about this. Is well, I can run a joke into the ground with the best of them. So after every episode, I kept saying, "Let that be a lesson to you." And then finally, the
Yeah.
penny dropped, and I went, "This is your Twilight Zone book, stupid. This is it.
Mhm.
All our life lessons. All you have to do is extract the life lessons, and you have basically a guide to life here with the Twilight Zone." So that's how the book came about,
Yeah.
and interestingly enough, for your purposes, um, that book is directly led to the Poe book.
Okay.
Nice.
Oh, very
Because
cool.
that book was done for St. Martin's. This book was
Yeah.
done for St. Martin's. Uh,
Okay.
this book did well enough, and when a book does well enough, you have a discussion with your publisher for the book that's called the option book. And
Yeah.
the option book it's in every author's contract with major publishers. The option clause basically says you have to give them the option on your next book. The
Mhm.
option is all theirs. They can turn it down
Yeah.
if they wish, but you have to let them know what. So after this book had been out and was doing well, we had a discussion about what the option book would be, and
Yeah.
um, and they didn't like any of my ideas for an option book, and I didn't like any of their ideas.
Oh gosh.
So we were about to get off the phone. I know we liked each other, and we would just decided we would table the conversation for another day because we
Yeah.
were just kind of spinning our wheels. And just as we were about to get off the phone, the editor said, "What about Edgar Allan Poe?" And I said, "What about him?" And he said, "Well, it's been a while since there's been a popular biography of Poe."
Hmm.
And he said, "I think it's time for another one. I think you're the one to do it." And I would have never positioned myself as much as I love Poe, and Poe is one of my favorite authors and all that. I would have.
Yeah.
You guys know I'm not shy, and you
Mhm.
know, you know, I have no shortage of confidence and ego, but not even I have the stones to go to a major publisher and say, who should rewrite the next biography of Edgar Allan Poe? You're looking at him. This is the guy. I didn't have that. It was his suggestion and his pointing out how much that was in my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
So basically, what I'm saying is, without this, you don't get this. Uh,
Okay.
so
Yeah.
Right.
this is the double-barreled uh, St. Martin's, one. So
Yeah.
this leads directly to this.
That's awesome.
Ooh.
And I was going to say, this is a great segue to kind of build in. So I know that just from reading your book, because I think there was a quote in your book from Rod's daughter where she
And
talked about Poe was an influence on Rod. And so can you talk a little bit about like what kind of influences did Poe have on him?
we would like to know more about that.
Hmm.
Well, Rod died at the age of 50. I remembered exactly where I was. I remember exactly what I was doing at the moment. I was driving in an Oldsmobile Cutlass in upstate New York.
Oh, wow.
And it was a very hot summer day. I was driving cross country. It had been between my freshman and sophomore year. And the radio was on, and it came in with the bulletin that Rod Serling had just died.
Oh,
Not too far from where I was driving. I was upstate. He died in Rochester, New
okay.
York. So not too far away from where I was driving at that moment.
Hmm.
And so I remember that very clearly. But because Rod died at 50, there's so many things we never got to ask him.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Now we know that Rod was a voracious reader. We know he loved reading stuff that fell on the spooky side.
Hmm.
We know that Poe was an influence.
Hmm.
How much of an influence and what exactly? What I would like to ask Rod is, I'd like to go beyond just the fact that we know that he read Poe and Poe was an influence. I
Yeah.
would like to then ask him what specifically, you
Yes.
know, what did it for you? Was it Telltale Heart? Was it the Cask of Amontillado? Was it the Pit and the Pendulum? What was it that did it for you?
Yeah.
And there are other influences, obviously, on this Twilight Zone,
Oh, absolutely.
but Poe is there, and Poe also, not to minimize this, because Poe also is a more direct influence on all the other writers who wrote for the Twilight Zone. He's an immense influence. I mean, if you look at all of the Roger Corman Poe movies, and we know they're not,
Yes.
models of fidelity to Poe and his writing,
Hmm.
but they are one of the major things that keep Poe going in the early 60s as a pop culture presence.
Yeah.
All of those Roger Corman movies were written by either Richard Matheson or Charles Beaumont, who were the other two principal writers on the Twilight
Hmm.
Zone.
Yeah.
So, you see that influence it permeates everything as far as the Twilight Zone is concerned,
Yeah.
you know. But again,
Absolutely.
uh, I have no idea. For instance, I'm sure Rod read Mark Twain. Absolutely. I have
Oh,
no
I,
idea what
yeah.
he read. I have no idea what book was important to him. We didn't get to that phase of his career where we asked those questions, where we had the chance,
Yeah.
and I never got the chance to meet Rod. I, had the chance to meet his family. I met his wife, Carol.
Hmm.
Anne Serling wrote the forward to the book. And I've met Jody Serling, the other daughter. Um,
Hmm.
and I've met friends. I've met people who worked on the Twilight Zone. Richard Matheson was a very close and dear friend for many years.
Yeah.
Um, but beyond, you can't go beyond what you know, and all we really know is
Yeah.
Poe's there. But it's
Absolutely.
up to a complete speculation as to, it's not so much what, but it's how,
Hmm.
what did it for you, and that we don't know.
Yeah.
People in high school in the 1930s were getting Poe, and my father, it was when it was in high school, a little older than Serling was, and he
Hmm.
he got Poe in the 1930s in high school. So,
Yeah. That's
yeah.
really cool.
Mhm.
That really is. And I think, like you said, this was something that didn't get to be answered because he died really way too early. And so to me, I think it's sometimes when you look at different Twilight Zone episodes, you get those themes of, premature burial, paranoia, just the horror elements. The devil is, prominent in several of the episodes, things
Sure.
that Poe wrote about, and just the dreamlike states, surrealism and things like that. It almost, it's like, I'm sure it wasn't just Poe, obviously, but pulling from many of the people he read, he culminated, just kind of synthesized all of these.
I'd say yes. I mean, one, one writer who obviously influenced the Twilight Zone.
Hmm.
Poe is considered, one of the great, not only American but all world masters of the short story.
Yeah.
And the short story is a very difficult. It may be among writers, it's considered the most difficult form
Yeah.
because you have to do everything within like 5,000 words or thereabouts. You
Yeah.
don't have the elbow room that a novel gives you. Uh,
Hmm.
you have to have a beginning, middle, and an end. You have to, and that's what the Twilight Zone had to do. The Twilight Zone had to do all that in a half hour. The
Yeah.
Twilight Zone is very much short stories.
Hmm.
It is the TV equivalent of short stories. And
Yeah.
that's where Poe was the absolute master. And another later American writer who was sort of the master of the short story is O. Henry.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And it's from O. Henry that Serling gets the twist ending.
Okay. Yeah.
Poe is not so big on the twist ending, the kind of those
Yeah.
Twilight Zone snappers that, make the hairs on the back of your neck go.
Yes.
Poe's doing that throughout his stories,
Absolutely.
and there are those, those kind of jump scare moments where, the the buried lady comes lurching out, at the
Yes.
end. You have those, but that's not really the Twilight Zone's MO,
Yeah, that is
But
true.
so you kind of have this kind of we're in Poe territory because where we're really in Poe territory is the fact that Poe understood human fear better than any other writer. So, psychologically, he understood it
Yeah.
better than anybody else who was writing at the time. It's why his stories have to say, and I've said this before, but, you know, there were a lot of people writing horror in Poe's time.
Yes. Hmm.
The magazines of the day was just full of them.
Hmm.
All of the British and American magazines, they loved all of that lurid, penny dreadful type of stuff. And
Yeah.
it's everywhere. And, we just don't read most of it was just utter bilge, but
Hmm.
Poe stands out because, Ray Bradbury once said that, who is also an influence on the Twilight Zone,
Absolutely.
also, and actually do adapt one of his stories to the Twilight Zone.
Hmm.
But, Bradbury said, that Poe took the horror story, he made literature of it.
Hmm.
And that's so that is where you see that influence on the Twilight. The Twilight Zone effectively works because it works on those fears.
Yeah,
It works on all of those. The loss of identity, who you are, is a big theme in the Twilight Zone. There are a lot of
that
episodes
is
where
true.
all of a sudden people are in a world where the rules no longer make sense,
Yeah.
where, they recognize everybody, but nobody recognizes them. What would happen if you woke up and your world was no longer your world? There are all these great fears that are at play in the Twilight Zone.
Hmm.
And that is something which that's where we're really playing in Poe territory when
Yeah.
where we're in the Twilight Zone. Um, I'd say the major difference between Poe and the Twilight Zone is that Poe really didn't believe in a moral.
Hmm.
If you got to the end of a Poe story, as a matter of fact, this is what hurt Poe's reputation for a long time because the literature of the 1800s, especially the American literature of Poe's time, stressed uplift, the whole idea that
Hmm.
literature was supposed to ennoble. Literature was supposed to, in some ways, take your character and strengthen your character. And this is why
Hmm.
the poets of the hearth, like Longfellow, were very popular. They were the superstars of this time because people
Yeah.
would read it, at the fireside to their family, and and
Hmm.
and then that leads directly into the Chautauqua movement of the
Hmm.
middle and late 1800s, and that is all about moral uplift. None
Yeah.
of those things liked Poe. None of those groups
True.
liked Poe because Poe was basically holding up a mirror to us, and it was an accurate mirror as to who we are.
Hmm.
And it really, I can't remember who said this. It's in my book, but one of the Poe scholars, may have been Jerry Kennedy, I can't remember.
Okay.
But I apologize for whoever said this because it's brilliant. But they basically said we had to catch up to Poe.
Yeah.
Poe was so far ahead of us. It took the 20th century for us to catch up to Poe. It took the horrors of the First World War and the Depression and the Second World War and the Holocaust and the atomic bomb. It took the horrors of the war for us to realize how relevant Poe was and how
That's
important.
true. Yeah, that is a great way to say that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So Poe is not, I mean, Poe doesn't, basically, you don't reach the end of a Poe story and you have that unsaid line at the end of a Poe story. And the moral of the story is,
Hmm.
now the Twilight Zone is very big on that.
Yes.
Twilight Zone, and the Twilight Zone operates under very strict rules of, if you bring certain things in the Twilight Zone, if you bring in love and empathy and devotion and love for a child and caring and all these things, if you take all of these wonderful things that are in our kit as human beings,
Hmm.
the Twilight Zone will reward you for those things.
Right.
But on the other hand, the people who'd really take it in the shorts in the Twilight Zone are always the people who take in greed and ignorance and
Yes.
prejudice and pettiness and, all of the nasty little things that are in our nature.
Hmm.
The Twilight Zone, sort of, if you bring those things in, you're going to get hit with a big old bolt of cosmic justice before the 30 minutes is over.
Absolutely.
So there is this kind of, justice in the Twilight Zone.
Hmm.
Where it's just, no, perfectly innocent people sometimes did get put through terrible things in the Poe stories, is
Right. Hmm.
so there is a difference, is what I'm saying. There's a
Yeah.
profound influence on the Twilight Zone without question. But you
Hmm.
have to remember that, Poe is many things, as I've always, stressed
Yeah.
that, he was not just a horror writer. But the reason we still read the horror stories is because they are just so good,
Yes.
because he was just so good at it.
Hmm.
Those small group of stories are not the majority of what he wrote. They weren't anywhere near the majority of what he wrote,
Hmm.
but they are still the most resonant things he wrote.
Absolutely.
And there's a reason those small groups of stories have defined him
Yeah.
and have continued to define him. And those stories are so powerful that they just keep influencing generation after generation after generation. But they influenced everything because, again, the Twilight Zone wasn't really a horror show.
True.
Nope.
That
And
is
that's one
true.
of the reasons
Yeah.
that's why I say you've got both here. You've got that tremendous influence of Poe and it surrounds and it permeates the Twilight Zone. And then you've got these kind of major differences. And the reason is because the Twilight Zone is very hard to pin down.
Yeah.
You try to define the Twilight Zone, and you go, well, was it a horror show? Some weeks it was, but
Hmm.
not every week. Some weeks it was fantasy. It was definitely not. Some weeks it was science fiction. Some people always have kind of labeled it a science fiction show, but The Outer Limits was the science fiction show.
Yeah,
The
that's
Outer Limits
true.
was on, concurrent with the Twilight Zone, and it was strictly a science fiction throw. Thriller on NBC, Boris Karloff hosting, was the horror show.
Yes.
It
Hmm.
was very much the horror show, and very much was in many ways more in Poe's wheelhouse than almost anything else that was on.
That's true. Yeah.
You know, so and then you had Alfred Hitchcock Presents as the mystery show.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Poe, of course, is the father of the modern mystery story. You could make an argument that Poe influenced every single one of those four anthology shows.
I
There's
would
the four,
agree.
major anthologies. You had a lot of the same writers writing, swapping back and forth. You had a lot of
Hmm.
people writing for the different ones. And you could argue that, does Poe help shape the Twilight Zone? He sure does, but that's shortchanging him because
Yeah.
he's also got a profound influence on Thriller, The Outer Limits, and Alfred Hitchcock Presents as well.
That is very true. Absolutely. Jeannie, thoughts?
Well, the one thing that really gets me about Rod Serling in the Twilight Zone is, like Mark's saying, it wasn't just about horror, it was science fiction, it was all this. But the one thing that every episode I always watched would get me would be the psychological parts of it that was
Absolutely.
coming out. No matter what the story was, there's always this psychological thought process that was brought about either from the story itself, from one of the characters in the story, or something like that. And that's what always jumped out at me about being related to Edgar Allan Poe,
I,
because
I
his
agree. Yeah.
stories, yeah, his stories were always making you thought, making you think, not thought, making you think about whatever is going on, whether it was in his satire, whether it was in his detective fiction or his
Mhm.
horror or whatever it was, he was always on that edge about the psychological,
Agreed.
making you think.
If
And
go ahead.
go ahead. No, I was just going to say, and that's one thing with Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone that I love the most is like every one of them was always making you think, making you question whether it be morality, whether it be social injustice, whatever it was, there was always something that made you think. And the one story that always from the Twilight Zone sticks in my head most was about the astronauts. They land, and then there's this woman who's all by herself, and she's making dinner, and then she thinks there's somebody there. And then at the very end, you see these astronauts, these US astronauts in their little spaceship, but they are literally little, you know,
Mhm.
Oh,
compared
is that the
compared
episode
to,
with Agnes Moorehead?
Yes, it's called The
yes,
Invaders, and
Yes, that's so good.
yes,
that was written by Richard Matheson actually, and
Okay.
yes,
Okay.
it is very bold because it's done without words.
yes,
Yes.
It's all done with sound, and at the end you realize who are the invaders. Well, we're the invaders.
Right.
hmm
Yes.
Mhm.
And it was also, you could see different writers in the Twilight Zone brought different themes. And and often enough, the themes were influenced by Poe. And one of the themes that ran through a lot of Richard's early work was the sense of isolation,
hmm
the sense
Yes.
of alienation. It was always about the lone person up against the biggest odds. He writes before the Twilight Zone, he writes I Am Legend, which is about one man in a
Wow.
world of vampires
Hmm.
yep,
and against overwhelming forces. He writes The Incredible Shrinking Man about somebody
Wow.
literally withdrawing from, the ultimate alienation. And you see that in a lot of Richard's work, that sense of alienation. And that's a very strong episode for that because she's all by herself. She's in a
yep,
farmhouse. She's all by
Yeah.
herself. She's isolated and she's under attack. Uh,
Hmm.
and we don't know by what, and we don't know by, and that is a very strong sense in Poe. It is a very strong sense in the Twilight Zone. But I think one of the things that's remarkable about Poe is, and most of the great writers, the 19th century, I think you could say this about Dickens, who knew and met Poe, and they admired each other, and
Hmm.
they both were before we had a term for Freudian psychology because there had been no
hmm
Freud yet.
Right.
They were both amazingly perceptive psychological observers.
yep,
Absolutely.
You read
Hmm.
Dickens and you go like, wow, this guy's laser focused on
Yes.
people, which is another way of saying, one of the things that always, separates great writing and makes great writing endures is the understanding that of human nature and that human nature doesn't change. That's why, we can read Shakespeare now is that even though it's set in a different time and the language seems to come from a different world,
Hmm.
the Shakespearean themes are timeless because Shakespeare was a keen observer of human nature.
Yeah.
And he understood that, human nature, you can dress it up in any way you want. You can put it in a Roman toga. You can put
Hmm.
it in, in Italy in the 1500s. You could put it in Elizabethan England, and it's all going to be resonant.
Yeah.
hmm
And it's one of the reasons we're
Absolutely.
still watching The Twilight Zone and we're still reading Poe is because of this amazing understanding of human nature.
Hmm.
And all the great writers that have endured, you see that is a common theme. It's a common theme with Twain. That Twain understood human nature better than anybody else of his time.
Absolutely.
And so this is the one thing that the Twilight Zone, I think, really this is a point of comparison with Poe, is that um, the understanding of human nature
yep,
is just every single episode it just crackles in every single episode, the
Hmm.
good and the bad. You know,
Yeah.
there's certain episodes which look, just today, my wife and I had eating lunch at the same time. We said, "You want to watch something?" So we popped into Twilight Zone. Actually, not because I was doing this tonight, but we
Yeah.
watched the episode Death's Head Revisited.
Oh, that's
Mhm.
a very moving episode.
Which is, Rod's, I think, ultimate statement on World War II and the Nazis and the
Yeah.
Holocaust. And it is the only Twilight Zone, by the way, here's a trivia point. It is the only Twilight Zone narration. Every single Twilight Zone narration ends with the words, the Twilight Zone, you know. So
Hmm.
Rod would say something like to be found in a province known as the Twilight Zone. And
Yeah.
that was the end. That episode was the only one that did not end with the words the Twilight Zone.
I did not realize
Because
that.
he wanted to distinguish that episode
Okay.
about it's set in Dachau, and it's about a German SS officer going back to sort of relive the happy days
Hmm.
of
Mhm.
concentration camp and literally being haunted and finally condemned and tried by the ghosts of Dachau.
Yeah.
It's a very powerful episode. It's an extraordinarily powerful episode. Um, so it looks at the dark things too. It looks at the enduring spirit. The Twilight Zone embraced the enduring human spirit, the things we're
Hmm.
capable of. But it did not flinch from looking at where we are when we are not the human condition, but the inhuman condition.
Yeah.
You know?
Mm.
And that's where something like I said, the Twilight Zone, week to week, it was very different. It hit
Yep.
different themes. It hit different, some weeks it was horror. Some weeks it was out and out a horror episode. Um, one of their finest episodes um, was an episode called Night Call, and they did in the fifth season. And Gladys Cooper plays an elderly woman who's confined to her bed most of the time because she's an invalid.
Hmm.
And there's a storm, and in the middle of the night, her phone keeps ringing, and there's nobody there. And there's nobody there, and she keeps complaining, and they finally trace the line that has come down in the storm, and the line has come down, and it's lying across a grave in the cemetery.
Yes. Yeah.
Now,
It's
I don't think I'm going to
very.
tell you the payoff, but just that's got you, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, and
Oh yes.
I've seen it. It is one of the best ones. Yes.
You get the whole sense of this woman alone, and and her personality is very well defined. Uh, so there were episodes is that, and that episode could have been on Thriller. That episode easily
Mhm.
could have been on Thriller, as and there are other episodes that it could have been on The Outer Limits. There are other episodes that could have been on Alfred Hitchcock. And there's some episodes week to week that were comedies. Twilight Zone didn't mind doing a comedy every now and again.
Yeah, that's
Well,
true.
so they hit a lot of different notes. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm trying to remember what it's called. I think it's the first season, last episode with
Keen and Win.
yes, that one.
It's a world of a world of his
Yeah,
own. It's called. So it's
that's
a
a
world of
great
his own.
comic one.
Yeah, and that's Richard Matheson again.
Okay.
And the interesting thing of that is that Rod actually appears in the episode at the end.
Yes.
The final joke has Rod in it, and in the first, you can always tell if it's a first season episode if you don't see Rod at the beginning in the opening narration, you just hear him.
Okay.
Starting with the second season, they put him on camera at the beginning of the episode.
Okay.
So
Okay.
that's it's always the first season if you don't see Rod. But I think one of the reasons they put him on camera at the end of that last episode was sort of prepare people for the fact that he was going to come back and be on
Mhm.
camera.
Yes.
It was kind of like a statement of the man behind the voice, because it had that Wizard of Oz thing about the man behind the curtain, the all powerful Oz. You always heard his voice, but you never saw his face until the very end, and then it's like, oh, you're just a man, because that's kind of what I got with it, because I love Rod's voice, and that's one thing that's
Yeah.
always drawn me to most of the actors that I have loved the most. Is I always get drawn in by their voice first. Like with Roger Moore. not Roger Moore. Connery, Sean Connery.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sean Connery was one that I heard his voice, and it's like every time he was in anything, all I wanted to do was just hear his voice. Didn't have to see his face, just hear his voice.
Hmm.
And I guess that goes back to the radio specials that
Yeah.
I would get hooked because it would be certain radio specials, like Johnny Dollar. I don't know if anybody's ever watched or heard Johnny Dollar, the old radio classic of Johnny Dollar, but just the voices, they're so much of a staple of the story.
Mhm.
And I guess with Rod being his voice, to me, started the staple of the Twilight Zone that kept me coming back because it was like, "Ooh, I want to hear that voice because
I'll
he's
tell
going
you,
to tell me a story."
I'll tell you another parallel with Poe, which is their greatest, again, the Twilight Zone is by far and away the thing that Rod Serling is best known for. It has
Mhm.
Hmm.
overtaken everything, and it's kind of obliterated the fact that Rod had this whole career before the Twilight Zone, where he was
Wow.
this very distinguished writer writing for television, and it
Hmm.
kind
Mhm.
of obliterates the fact that there was kind of a third act after the Twilight Zone where he writes movie scripts. He's one of the writers on Planet of the Apes. He writes screenplays for 7 Days in May, and then there's the Night Gallery, and Rod's best work on Night Gallery is quite good. It's been underrated. He's some of his best scripts were on Night Gallery. So, he's only 50 years old and he kind of manages three acts. And
Mhm.
the
Wow.
middle act, which is the Twilight Zone, is so big, it has become such a pop culture thing. It
Hmm.
sort of overshadowed everything.
Yeah.
And it's kind of the same thing that happened to Poe, which is that Poe writes enough to fill 17 volumes of his collected works.
Yeah.
It's this much of it is that we read and has identified him. Their greatest, the thing they're best known for, has somewhat turned both of them into caricatures.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Poe is we lose who the real Poe is because we've kind of made him into this gloomy grandfather of goth figure.
Hmm.
And what we did with Rod was Rod became, one of the most imitated people on television. People, and
Yeah.
when they imitated, they did that clipped voice which he narrated every episode of the Twilight Zone. And
Yes.
the way he was very serious, the way he, arched his eyebrows, and he always looked good in those tailored suits,
Yeah.
and he always looks, and I think everybody kind of thought that that's kind of who Rod was. Well, Rod didn't talk that way off camera.
Mhm.
That was
Mhm.
his on-camera voice. So
Yeah.
he had a more normal speaking voice. That was kind of his TV voice. And
Yeah.
Rod was a devoted family man, had a great sense of humor. He loved playing practical jokes on people. He loved standing on his head in restaurants. He did a great gorilla impression. Uh, this is like the guy was, he was a big kid in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I always strongly recommend, that if you want to know who the real Rod Serling was, Anne Serling's memoir of her dad, my dad as I knew him, Rod Serling,
Okay.
a wonderful book, and it's as close as
Okay.
you can get to meeting the real Rod Serling, because there is the real Rod Serling, the father, the husband, the friend, the cut up, and so we have kind of made caricatures of both Rod Serling and Edgar Allan Poe, and we've
Wow.
taken this much of their personality and this much of their work, and we've sort of let that define them. And then we've done, and let's face it, it's fun. The
Yeah.
most fun aspects of these guys are the Twilight Zone, and all those wonderful spooky stories that Poe wrote and poems.
Absolutely. Yeah. But
And
they both were so much more. Yes.
well, and they also are the work that they did that has the most, that continues to have resonance.
Hmm.
It's the thing about the Twilight Zone is there are many episodes of the Twilight Zone which are more resonant today than when they first aired.
Hmm.
I'll give you a perfect example. The people always say, like, well, what's your favorite Twilight Zone episodes? And I always say, well, that answered it differs depending on the day you ask me. You know?
Okay.
But there are certain episodes that are so almost always in the mix. And one of them for me is a first season episode called The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street.
Oh, that's so good.
And The Monster Due on Maple Street, is a perfect little suburban street where all the neighbors know each other, like each other, and it's a summer evening and everything is wonderful and right before dinner and before the barbecues get lit up and the ice cream vendor is going up and down the street and all of this, a meteor goes past and then nothing works on Maple Street.
Yeah.
Nothing will start, the cars won't start, the radios don't work, the phones won't work, nothing works. And a kid says, well, this is how it happens in all the stories, is
Yeah.
that nothing works. And they've always sent people ahead who looks just like everybody else, but they're not. They're, and now everybody's looking at each other,
Yeah.
fear and paranoia. Now, by the end of the episode, Maple Street has, devolved into chaos and violence. And it's been driven to that by mistrust and fear of each other and paranoia and division. They've all taken all their idiosyncrasies and quirks and, well, you like to stay up late at night and look up at the stars. What are you looking at? What are you waiting
Yeah.
for? You have a ham radio. Nobody's ever seen that radio. Who are you talking to on that radio? And everybody is now there's no question. Rod Serling was writing about the McCarthy era, the anti-communist Red
Mhm.
Scare 1950s. There's no
Mhm.
question he was crafting a parable for what happens when fear and paranoia sets neighbor against neighbor,
Absolutely.
friend
Mhm.
against friend. But that episode, and I had to put a lesson to that episode, and the major lesson I put on that episode was divided we fall.
Yep.
Mhm.
That if we do not find a way to coexist, to talk to each other, to understand each other, we ain't going to make it.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That episode, you watch it now, and that episode seems more resonant now than at any point in our history.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And, there's a program in Binghamton, in Rod's hometown, where if the fifth graders are given episodes of the Twilight Zone,
Oh, no.
Nice.
and so it's like a fifth dimension uh, learning tool.
Uh-huh.
And one year, with the teacher who was responsible for it, the teacher showed them the monsters are due on Maple Street. And at the end of the episode, the lights came up, and she looked at the class and she said, "Who are the monsters?" And they all stood up.
Oh, wow.
Every single student stood up.
That's powerful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we are the
Wow.
monsters. Yeah.
That is so powerful.
So I mean, that's the kind of resonance some of those Twilight Zone episodes have.
Mhm.
And they have a punch. It's like, with Poe's best stories, they have a punch that are just every bit as good as the day, some ways better, and some ways more, you know,
Yeah.
more resonant today than ever before. Like I said, we took a while for us to catch up to Poe. The Twilight Zone just keeps speaking to us. It's in black and white, lessons crafted during the Eisenhower administration for a black and white world and a three network world, in a world that didn't know iPhones or home computers or an internet or anything like that.
Yeah.
And there's just every bit as powerful as when they first aired.
I agree with you. Last semester, I teach freshman English, and our last unit for the semester is dystopian. And so one of the stories that we read is There Will Come Soft Rains by Ray Bradbury. The kids really like that story, and so I decided, okay, I'm going to pick some more of the dystopian episodes and see if I can find copies of the short story. And so one of them, the first one I did showed them was, well, we read it first, Time Enough at Last with Burgess Meredith, when we watched the episode with him. And the kids at first were like, this is black and white. I said, yeah. But then when they made, like, reading it almost kind of took away the oomph at the end of the actual episode,
Hmm.
but when they saw it like in action and put in place, they got it and they were like, this is just so sad. And I said, yeah. And so they got a lot out of it. And I did just a couple of other ones. And I just, it was neat showing this generation something that they might not have ever seen if I hadn't shown it. I mean, they may find it one day because none of them had seen it at all.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned that episode because
Yeah.
that episode, I'm kind of on record as not being crazy about that episode.
Okay.
Mhm.
And this is why. Okay, this is why. I mean,
Yeah.
number one, it contains, without question, the most iconic image of anything in the Twilight Zone, and probably the most O. Henry-like ending of the
Mm-hmm.
Twilight Zone. And in fact, if you look at my book there in the upper corner, I mean, they're the broken glasses.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's impossible to talk about the Twilight Zone without talking about that episode.
True. Yeah.
And I'll tell you a quick story is that, I was really good friends with Richard Matheson. I was pretty good friends with Ray Bradbury as well.
Mm-hmm.
But another a writer who was a close friend of both of them, who I became close friend with, was Harlan Ellison. And I remember I went out to dinner. I was out there on business, and Harlan loved nothing better than introducing friends of his to friends of his. He'd like to get
Mm-hmm.
people who didn't know each other, and so he would always encourage me to bring a friend along, and he would bring a friend, and we would introduce. He loved that kind of friend swapping type of thing, and
Yeah.
it was good. It always kind of worked out. People became very good friends. Well, one night we went to a restaurant in Studio City, and it was a screenwriter by the name of Charles Edward Pogue and his wife Julianne.
Okay.
It was Charles Edward's birthday. He wrote some great screenplay. He wrote the screenplay to the remake of The Fly, for instance.
Oh, wow.
You
Okay.
know, with Jeff Goldblum and Gina
Yeah.
Davis.
Mm-hmm.
So he's a wonderful guy, wonderful writer, and and he and Harlan were friends. So Harlan and his wife Susan and Charles Edward and his wife Julianne, and I had brought along another TV critic, David Bean Cooley, with me. So it was the
Okay.
six of us. We went to a restaurant in Studio City, and it was going so well. It was having such a good time that Harlan said, "Let's keep it going." And so we walked across the street. There's this famous little coffee and cake pastry called Duparge restaurant on
Okay.
Ventura Boulevard. So we went. The six of us took it like a booth in Duparge, and we fell to talking about the Twilight Zone. And when two or more are gathered, you get that sort of glassy-eyed look that people get when they talk about the Twilight Zone. And somebody immediately, oh, the glasses, remember the broken glasses. And I let everybody sort of talk about it for a while. And Harlan kind of noticed I wasn't saying anything. And so finally he said to me, like I said, "Okay, well, what's the matter? Don't you like that episode?" And I said, "Well, if you want to know the honest truth, I'm not crazy about it." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Look, people were punished and rewarded in the Twilight Zone for what they brought in, as we were speaking it before. What
Mhm.
did this guy do? What was this guy's crime? Oh, he wants to read. Well, how dare he? How dare he want to share his love of reading?" And I said, "And who? Look at the episode. He's not the villain of the episode.
No.
The wife is the villain of who is there a worse character in the history of the Twilight Zone than that awful, terrible wife who says it takes his book of poetry and says, 'Read me,' and he thinks, oh, she's finally got it. She's going to share this love, and he
Yeah.
whips, and she has defaced every page.
Oh, it's so
There are more
awful.
cruel acts in the history of the Twilight Zone. And then this poor guy, what's his reward for all of this? Is that it's an outlier, really. This episode. Now, having said all that, it's visually one of the greatest Twilight Zone episodes. It is a fantastic performance by Burgess Meredith.
Yes.
It's,
Mhm.
I can sing this episode's praises all day long, but it also violates its own code of ethics. The Twilight
Yep.
Zone's code of how things go. I
Mhm.
have a much more favorite episode starring Burgess Meredith, and that's The Obsolete Man,
Oh, yeah, that's so good.
where
Yes.
he is a librarian.
Hmm.
It,
Uh-huh.
now we're cheering books and we're cheering words, and the state's going to execute him because they have banned books.
Hmm.
And it's a
Mhm.
it's a blast at a totalitarian state trying to control what we read. Once again,
Yes.
do we, and the final narration, is a civilization that does not value the printed word and the value of the human being is not civilized.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, it's a to me, it's a much greater message. It's a much better episode. I love that
Yeah, I
episode.
do too. It's so good.
And he even gives the character a Dickensian name. Burgess Meredith's name in that is Romney Wordsworth.
Yes.
Wordsworth. I mean, it's just like he's trying to tell you, words are important. Reading is important.
Yeah.
Um, it's just a terrific episode, first to last.
Yeah.
You know,
Okay,
Absolutely.
now help me out because I'm getting the visual, but I can't distinguish which of the episodes I'm getting the visual for because it's been so long. But I'm seeing a visual of a guy, and there's like a desert area, but there's stacks of books everywhere.
well, that
And my
sounds like the end of Time Enough at Last.
Yeah, it
Okay,
does.
all
That,
right,
that sounds
so
like the end after the atomic war
yes,
exchange is going
Yeah.
to wipe out all human, and he finds the library and he stacks the books up on the.
yes,
Yeah.
that's the one because you were talking and all of a sudden that was popping into my head and I'm going, I don't think that's either one of the episodes they're talking about, but that's the
Mhm.
one that was popping into my head
No,
is
that
him just sitting there and there was like nothing else around but just stacks of books.
Yep, that's it. That's Time Enough at Last, and then the glasses break, and and I always
Yes.
kind of hope for that. And the thing is, there was no way I could not include that in my book, that episode.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's no
It's
way. I mean, you cannot ignore Time Enough at Last. It is,
yeah, it's iconic. Yeah.
it is, and what are you going to do? So I had to put a lesson on it. There's,
Yes.
Yes.
Miss Meredith at the end, bless his heart.
Yeah.
And I had to put a lesson on that. And because the Twilight Zone does have this sort of set of rules that it operates under, and I
Mhm.
realized that this one is an outlier.
Yeah.
I decided that the life lesson I was going to put on this was something my mother used to say. And I remember when we were kids, there were five of us, and we're rambunctious kids who were all between 10 years of age, and so there were inevitable arguments, and there were complaints, and they were always brought to the Lord High Judge, which was my mother. And
Mm-hmm.
and my mother would always, if something went against what one of the kids wanted, the wail that one of the kids would set up was, well, that isn't fair.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother's response was always, nobody said life was fair.
Well,
Mm-hmm.
my mama would say the exact same thing.
Yes.
Mhm.
Like,
And I hated it then, and I hate it now, but I recognize the truth of it.
Yeah.
And that's the life lesson I put on that episode. As a matter of fact,
Yeah.
those are the very words that character speaks at the end of the episode when his
hmm
glasses break and he holds them up and he says, that isn't fair.
Yeah.
That's,
yes.
that's the very words he uses. And we agree with him. It isn't fair. It's a
Mm-hmm.
No.
powerful ending because it isn't. And so I had to put a life lesson onto that. And I said, sometimes life isn't fair. And every once in a while, the Twilight Zone isn't either.
Yeah.
No.
That it'll violate its own rule to say, yeah, sometimes, you're going to take it in the shorts and you don't deserve it.
Yeah.
No.
Absolutely. Oh, I know. There's so many good episodes. It's hard to like pick favorites because there's so many good ones.
Well, and
Well,
there's
but
so many memorable ones too.
Yes.
yeah.
Mhm.
Well, that's what I was going to say. It's like there may not be a favoritism for many of them, but each and every one of them are favored in their own right.
I
Yeah.
agree. Yeah, I agree. There's, you know, um, some of Rod's best episodes, again, relate to today in some way. He wrote one called Eye of the Beholder.
Oh, yeah.
hmm
There's it's a woman whose face is all you see is the bandages, and they're trying to, her face is ugly and deformed, and the doctors are working to. This is the last operation that they can possibly try, so she can be part of a society where a standard of beauty has been imagined, but everything is shot in shadows, and and then at the very end they take the bandages off, and she's beautiful. It's in fact it's Donna Douglas, Ellie Mae Clampett,
Yeah.
Yes.
from the
Yeah.
Maryland.
Uh-huh.
And then you see everybody else, and everybody else has distorted faces that we would consider, you know,
Ugly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and it's a wonderful lesson about the eye of beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but also the standard. What happens when a society decides what is beautiful,
Yeah.
what is
hmm
ugly, and
Hmm.
what is worthy and what isn't worthy. And that's an episode again, fr from 1960,
Yeah,
Yep.
and it has all of this just tremendous resonance, 65 years later.
I know.
This
And
enormous, resonance to what goes on today.
hmm yeah, and I would say there's so many episodes, like you said, that do transcend time. They're timeless, that do fit in society now. And the lessons, like with from what you wrote in your book, it's just phenomenal just to think about them. And what I really enjoyed about reading your book was kind of thinking about what I've always perceived from the episodes that you wrote about and the lessons that you put, and just kind of just really reflecting on that. And so I would go rewatch some of the episodes as I was reading to kind of like tie all this together. And so that was really neat for me.
And the book itself was kind of a lesson.
Mhm.
The book itself was for me, it was a lesson. It's just, uh, and yeah, have you got a couple minutes?
Yeah, you're fine.
This
You're fine.
this is a very circular story.
Okay.
My first book was published in 1982. And,
Okay.
yeah, my bones creaked when I said that out loud. Uh, but it was a slice of theater history, and
Okay.
it was a history of the Barter Theater in Abingdon, Virginia, which had been
Okay.
started.
Oh, cool. Been there. Yay.
I covered it for 5 years early in my career, and there had been no history of it. And it was this wonderful theater where actors like Ned Beatty and Ernest Borgnine and Patricia
Mhm.
Neal and Gregory Peck had gotten their start.
Neat.
And it was, this was wonderful old theater. So, that was published in 1982. You know, um, and right before the book was going to be published, people started asking, and it's a very flattering question. They would ask you, what's your next book going to be? Because that predisposes there will be another book, which is
Yeah.
never a given, never assured. But I kind of knew what my next book was going to be. I had sort of set my heart on writing the first history of the Twilight Zone. You know,
Hmm.
I was living and working in Upper East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia at the time.
Hmm.
My backyard. Yes.
Yes, but also not the best place to be researching the Twilight Zone.
No.
If you were going to set up headquarters for writing about the Twilight Zone, and
Yeah.
I had been doing enough work to sort of fool myself into thinking I was actually going to be the person to do this.
Mhm.
Uh, Two of the actors who were got their start at the Barter Theater were both in two Twilight Zone episodes. Fritz Weaver
Okay.
and,
Yes.
and Claude Akins were
Mhm. Oh,
in.
yeah.
So I had interviewed both of them about that. Um, Donna Douglas, who we just talked about in Eye of the Beholder, she came to town to shoot a commercial dressed as Ellie Mae Clampett, and I ran down to the shooting site and I interviewed her about the being in Eye of the Beholder and the Twilight Zone. I'm doing enough work here to sort of fool myself into
Yeah.
thinking. And then in 1982, the same year that first book was published, I finally walked into a bookstore in Kingsport, Tennessee, and there it was, Mark Scott Secree's The Twilight Zone Companion. The history of the Twilight Zone. Yeah, I bought the book, I took it home, and I couldn't even be angry about it because Mark did such a great job with that book.
Yeah.
It,
Mhm.
1,000 times the job I would have ever been able to have been done with it. You know, I just was, but it was the dream of my youth to write the history of the Twilight Zone.
Hmm.
That dream was gone. So, being a practical person, I set my sight on my second favorite TV show, which was Columbo.
Yay. Yep.
A great one too.
The following year, I got the job as being the TV critic at the Akron Beacon Journal. I was being sent out to Los Angeles, twice a year, total of 5 weeks. It's like subsidized research. I was in the perfect place now to write the history of a TV show.
Absolutely.
And that was my second book was the Columbo File, which was
Mhm.
published in 1989. And at that point, that book was published by the Mysterious Press, which at the time was owned by Warner Books. And we were talking about the next book, the option book. And I had come up with an idea of a book about Dashiell Hammett, who the author of the Maltese Falcon and the Thin Man.
Mm-hmm.
I come up with a novel idea that they liked, and I thought, well, now this is kind of the path I'm on. I'm going to be sort of the mystery guy. I'm doing Columbo. Now I'm going to do Dashiell Hammett.
Yeah.
Now, two things I have learned in all the years I've been writing books, and it's kind of a Twilight Zone lesson, you know. The universe is smarter than you are. And the universe always kind of knows to push you in the right direction. You know, you may think you're the captain of your ship, you're in charge, you're the master of your destiny, and then something happens that pushes you and says, no, 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 no. And what happened was Warner Books stepped in and cut out all of the nonfiction line at the Mysterious Press.
Oh, wow.
And we hadn't signed the contract yet. Had agreed, we had a handshake deal. So it looked like
Mhm.
this was tied up pretty good and all the stitchings came loose. And I all of a sudden was left without another book and another publisher. And it was at that moment that a publisher called me and said, hey, I read your Columbo book and loved it. Have you ever thought about writing the same kind of book about the Night Stalker, the Kolchak series?
Mm-hmm.
I said, I love that series. I just didn't know there was a publisher crazy enough to publish a book about it. He said, well, I'm crazy enough to publish a book about it. This
Oh,
was the universe stepping in saying, no, you're not the mystery guy. The love of your childhood was horror. It was Universal monsters and dark shadows and the
mhm.
Twilight Zone. And this is it's all great. Columbo is this very special character to you, but and it pushed me in the right direction.
Yeah.
That's what led to the friendship with Richard Matheson. That's what led to, I wrote my first horror novel after that. Um, I edited 3 volumes of Richard Matheson's work for him, worked with him, side
Mhm.
by side, you know. Then I wrote a book on Dracula. And what was happening was I was working my way back to the Twilight Zone.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
didn't see it. I didn't see it because there's a pattern here, but again, the universe was smarter.
Yeah.
And finally, it was sharing the Twilight Zone with my daughter that gave me the whole idea on I'm going to get my Twilight Zone book.
Yeah.
And it took, about 35 years.
Yeah, circular motion, yes.
But I finally got my Twilight Zone book. And but it
Yeah.
was like the
And
universe
it's
saying,
incredible too.
that's not your Twilight Zone book. The book you first set out to write, that was Mark Scott Secree's Twilight Zone book.
Yeah.
Mhm.
This is your Twilight Zone book.
Mm-hmm.
This is the one you were meant to write, not that one. So you're going to get your Twilight Zone book. Be patient. It's
Yeah.
it's going to work out, but you can say so. There is a pattern there, and then you write the book, and it's always other people who tell you what you did because
Yep.
there's so many things that are subconscious about it. And I was at a book signing for it, and somebody came up to me and said, "Oh, I love your book. I love the whole father-daughter thing that's going on in the book." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And they said everything about the book is like, and I stopped and thought about it. I said, "He's right. He's absolutely right." The book begins, you know, with the daughter and ends with the father. It
Mhm.
begins with
Yeah.
me sharing the Twilight Zone with my daughter,
Mm-hmm.
which led to the father writing the book. The very first piece of writing in the book is by Anne Serling, the daughter.
Mm-hmm.
The last thing in the book is from a speech that Rod Serling gave in Akron, Ohio, a little bit before his death.
Mm-hmm.
So it literally begins with the daughter and ends with the father.
Yeah.
The, you know, and it begins with me sharing the book with my daughter, and the last thing in the book is the author's photo, which my daughter took.
Oh, that's
Hey.
so neat.
So,
Yeah.
and the book is dedicated to my daughter. I didn't see that. All of that stuff is should have been patently obvious to me
Yeah.
that
Yep.
it was there, but somebody else had to point it out and
That
say,
that is really special. That is really neat.
so yeah. So I
Well,
mean, and again, and that then leads to Poe. You
yeah.
know,
Mhm.
if I don't do the Twilight Zone, if I don't do Night Stalker,
Yeah.
I don't do Twilight Zone. If I don't do Twilight Zone, I don't do Poe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, so again, the universe is usually smarter than you are.
Yes,
Oh, it is.
absolutely.
As long as you listen and pay attention.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
and just be willing to go where it sends you. You're willing to be open to what is the
Yeah,
shape of the river is
yeah,
basically,
Yep.
you know,
absolutely.
and riding those currents in the right direction, not fighting the currents.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Mark, what are you working on right now? I think, aren't you working on Mark Twain?
The next book, out here again, is the pattern of my life. The pattern of my life is this. And you've already seen it. You already know what it is, but I'm going to articulate it, which is every single time since the first book was published in 1982,
Mm-hmm.
somebody has asked me what your next book is going to be. I always say the same thing, which is, well, I could tell you, but I would be wrong. Because I've
Yeah.
been wrong every single, after the Barter Theater book, I'd have told you it was going to be The Twilight Zone. It turns out to be Columbo. After Columbo, I would have told you it would have been Dashiell Hammett, but it wasn't. It was Night Stalker. I have been wrong every single time. After I finished, this book, and this book was published by St. Martin's, and I was working on a book about Stephen King at the time,
Okay.
Mhm.
which actually turned into my Shawshank Redemption book.
Mm,
But I thought St. Martin's would do it. St. Martin's didn't want to do it, so that went to a different publisher.
okay.
But that was what led to the opening for the Poe book. So after the Poe book was done, I had come up with an idea for them because I had a sit down with an editor at St. Martin's, and they said, the marketing people here really love you. You love to get out and promote, and
Yeah.
a lot of authors don't like to do that. A lot of authors think their job begins and ends with the writing, and a lot of writers are very shy, and
Hmm.
they don't tend to like to be, they're not very outgoing in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
But whatever quirk of nature it took over, I'm the opposite. I love to put on my tap shoes and go out and
Yeah.
and entertain and see people. Um, so the editor said, okay, as you're thinking about what to bring to us next, think brand. And I didn't know what that meant because I thought like brand. It says writers like John Grisham and Stephen King have a brand. I don't have a brand.
Yeah.
My books are all over the place. This is Columbo and Theodore Roosevelt and Mark Twain and
Hmm.
Dracula, Night Stalker. Like what brand? Well, I thought about it. Now remember, these are the two books I had done for them at that point, right? Okay.
Hmm.
Yep.
So I'm thinking brand. What could they mean? Ah, I get it. They want a book that falls sort of on the spooky side of the street.
Okay.
We did Twilight Zone. We did Poe.
Yeah.
Clearly, that's what they mean. So I sent them, some what I thought were really good ideas,
Yeah.
which fell into that. And I had a follow-up discussion with this editor, and she said, we like the ideas. They're good ideas. But let me ask you a question. She said, if we gave you a blank check, if you could write any book you wanted, and you knew we'd publish it, what would you send to us? And I said, well, I think I have one more book on Mark Twain in me. And I
Hmm.
think it's a book that would basically look at how we need to be listening to Mark Twain now more than any point in our history. That at a point where Mark Twain is dropping out of curriculum left and right, nobody's teaching him anymore.
That is true. Hmm.
Nobody's reading him anymore. And this is a point where, Mark Twain was not a saint, but he was a prophet. And he is you talk about relevant. I mean, what he had to say about war and religion and bigotry and all of these things, I say, it always sounds like Twain's talking about us today, like the Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
And, she said, well, that sounds great. Why didn't you write that up and send that in as a proposal? I did, and they accepted it.
Oh, yay.
So that's going to be the next book. The book is called The Lightning Bug and the Lightning, which is from a something Twain said, which was the difference between the almost right word and the right word is a big difference. It's the difference between the lightning bug and the lightning. So this
Mhm.
book is going to look at like what we think of Mark Twain and what the reality is,
Oh, nice.
using
Okay.
very dramatic moments in his life
hmm
biographically to sort of set up the discussions of different topics of why we should be listening to Mark Twain. I don't know that it'll have any impact at all, but it's the book I kind of had to write. You know, five of my books are on Mark Twain. Like I said, I thought I had one more in me, and it would be sort of
Right.
the ultimate championing of Mark Twain, if you will.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But when they accepted the book, I said to them, "What happened to Brand?" And the editor said, "Well, this is your brand."
hmm
I said, "I don't get it." I said, "You know, what is my brand?" They said, "Well, the people here, the editor, the higher ups here, they see this as your brand, and your brand is taking iconic American writers and reinterpreting them for us in a way that makes them accessible and understandable to a wide audience.
Yes,
You did that for
absolutely.
Rod Serling, you did that for Edgar Allan Poe, and now you're going to do it for Mark Twain."
Yeah.
Yep.
See
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. That
I,
is so true.
I
That
didn't
is
see
so
it.
true.
So, like I said, it often takes somebody else
hmm
to point out. I mean, it's like with the Poe book, you know, it would not have been the book I would have brought to a publisher.
Yeah.
You know, and an editor, another editor at St. Martin's at that time was the one who said, "You're the person to do it." And I said, "How do you figure that?" And he said, "How isn't Poe in your wheelhouse?"
Yeah.
You know, he said, "Poe was the father of the modern horror story. You have written about landmark horror topics with your books on Dracula and the Night Stalker and such,
Yeah.
and the Twilight Zone.
hmm
Poe is the father of the modern detective story. You have written a book about a classic detective character with your
Yeah.
Columbo book. Poe was a critic most of his working life. You were a critic most of your working life. Poe
Yeah.
was one of the two major 19th century American authors. You have written books about the other major 19th century,
Yes.
Mark Twain. He said, "How does this not check all your boxes?"
Yeah.
And you know, I had to concede he was right. You know, I was like, but I would not have put all that together, and I certainly would not have said, you know, oh, you know, not only is it time for a new Poe biography, but I'm the one to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
And you did it well.
Well, it's my I'll say this: it's a book, a biography of Poe nobody else could have written. I
Mm,
don't say that's good or bad. I'm just saying that you can only be the type of writer you are.
Yeah.
And as I've always said, you know, I've always fallen back on that. You know, there have been a couple of really terrific biographies of Poe published in the last couple of years, uh,
hmm
academic biographies, you know,
Yeah.
really terrific. Copley's biography is wonderful. You know, it's not like we have had any shortage of biographies of Poe and really good ones, but they have been written by, you know, true scholars and academics. And um, my book is a working writer's study of a working writer.
Mhm.
I can't
Yeah.
pretend to be a kind of writer I'm not. I can't pretend to be a scholar or an academic, and I'm not going to pretend or put up any claim for that. But I think there is merit in the view of a working writer studying a working writer.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And you know, I think it's another way of looking at Poe.
Absolutely.
And as you know, I always fall back on something Stephen King said, which was, you know, if you do not like what I do, if you do not approve of what I do,
hmm
if what I do offends you in some way, all I can tell you is it's what I have.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that's how I kind of feel about, you know, that book, which is it's a perfect reflection of how I would have to write a biography of Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah.
You know, as you know, I set out and I did interviews. With Poe biographers and scholars and medical historians and
hmm
FBI agents and private detectives and pathologists. And Uh, and one reason was because I was a journalist for 43 years. That's what journalists do. Like
Yeah.
detectives, they go out and they do interview people. You look for
Hmm.
witnesses and you look for experts, and that's what you do, and
Yeah.
um, so that's the kind of book I was going to write.
Hmm.
If there's some validity to that, it's wonderful. But it's really kind of beside the point because it's the only kind of book I could have written. And
Yeah.
it's the only way I could have written it.
Hmm.
You know? So, like as I say to people, if you prefer an A to Z biography written, in a more scholarly way, there are some wonderful books out there. There's
Yeah.
just I'll be happy to recommend some of these for you. You know, I would have been incapable of writing that book, that type of book.
Yeah.
So,
Well, we love the one you gave us.
Exactly. It was needed. It was a Poe need.
Yes.
well, like I said, I hope it because again, it was meant to be a popular biography, meaning it was meant to be read by a wide audience.
Hmm.
Absolutely. Hmm.
And the writers I admire, like Twain and Poe and Serling,
Hmm.
they wrote for a popular audience.
Absolutely.
Mark
Mhm.
Twain once said that the works of the great writers are wine, and in comparison, my books are only water. But just remember this: everybody drinks water.
That's
Yep.
And
perfect.
so I've always kind of been on that side of the scale. I mean, why write if it's not to be read?
Yeah, absolutely.
And like I said, and I understand, like if you're an academic, if you're a scholar, you should do that. You should be writing at the highest possible academic scholarly standard.
Hmm.
I've lived off that stuff. I have benefited from that stuff. I applaud that stuff. I'm a fan of
Hmm.
it. Um, but it's not the way I can write. I'm a professional. I'm a professional writer in the sense that my code basically comes down to this. I once said this I used to teach writing at Kent State University.
Hmm.
I would teach a writing class every semester. And I would get, and I had, because of, my lowly bachelor's degree, I had to teach it through the journalism communication, uh,
Okay.
you know, the English department would have nothing to do with me, and which yeah, fine. I mean, that's it's your club, your rules. I don't, I'm not. Um, but I would get English students, who would tell me I learned more about writing in your class in the past few weeks than I learned in 4 years in teaching
Hmm.
English classes. And I said, don't be so hard on them. They're teaching theory over there,
Right.
and there's great value to that. There's great value to viewing and studying English and English literature that way. Uh,
Hmm.
I said, and I'm under a handicap because this is my theory. If I do not put nouns and verbs together effectively, my family doesn't eat. How do you like that theory? But
Yep.
that's how I have to write and have to teach. I
Yeah.
have to put those words together effectively enough so they don't turn the lights out here,
Right. Exactly.
you know. And I've had to, live my entire life that way.
Hmm.
So that's my theory. I'm going to teach you how to write to live, you know,
Hmm.
because that's my principle. That's my guiding principle. Uh,
Yeah.
so and like I said, and it's I think Poe was very much that kind of writer. He wanted to be
I
read.
agree. Hmm.
He was very much wanted to be the first American who made his living solely as a writer and an editor, solely
Yeah,
through his talents as a literary person.
absolutely.
So, I mean, that's another way I probably do identify with Poe. Yeah.
Hmm.
I agree.
Certainly with
Absolutely.
Mark Twain and Rod Serling, and also is the fact that these were three writers I fell under the spell of young, and that they all became heroes in different ways. Probably really in high school. Knew them before that, but in high school, the idea that a hero could be somebody who carried ideas instead of a gun,
Yep.
that really became very powerful. And those were three writers who really drove that home to me
Yeah.
when I was in high school. So, I owe him a lot. Well, so
Many people do.
in some
Oh
ways,
yeah.
I always look at these books as kind of paying it back a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think so.
Mhm.
yeah, fulfilling their dreams even though they're not here. So,
Yeah. Well, any other thoughts on Poe or Serling?
No, oh, if that's for me.
Oh yeah, or Jean, yeah, whomever wants to speak.
yeah. No, I think we've fully covered the Poe zone.
Yes,
Well, I'll tell you
ozone.
this. I'll end with this because the name has come up a couple times. The person who you would have most loved to have had on your show um,
Mhm.
would probably been Ray Bradbury.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
Ray was the true Poe descendant,
Hmm.
and he wrote
aw,
several stories which were homage to Poe.
Yes.
yeah.
Wrote a second House of Usher story. He wrote one um, uh, which was a homage to the Telltale Heart. And he wrote a story, where Poe shows up as a character. Um,
Hmm.
so I mean, Poe shows up several times in Bradbury stories, but uh,
Hmm.
Ray could go on and on about Poe, his influence, and you know, it's interesting because Poe is a poet as well as a short story writer,
Hmm.
and Ray's writing was very poetic.
Yes.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Of all the fantasy writers of the 1950s, the great fantasy writers, his is, the prose is the most poetic of
Yeah.
all. And I like to think that that's almost like a perfect blending of Poe, the
Yeah.
masterful short stories and the poetic quality, all in the same package.
Yeah. That is so true. Yeah, his writing is phenomenal as well.
And I was lucky that, because we had discussed Poe a couple times, and in the Poe biography, I included a couple of Bradbury's
Hmm.
observations about Poe.
Hmm.
Because, like I said, I think he was the true acolyte, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
all those guys, and they all, like I said, Robert Bloch, Charles
Hmm.
Beaumont, Matheson, Serling. I think they all an enormous debt to Poe, but Ray was the one who I think really shouted it the loudest.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was a true fan. He
Oh
was
yeah.
like his fanatic was all about the Poe.
Mhm. Well,
That's good.
Bradbury got all the right writers at the right age. I mean, he
Yeah.
was reading Melville, he was reading Whitman, he was reading Emily Dickinson, he was reading
Yeah.
Jane, and Poe.
Hmm.
Uh, that mixed bag, you see it all in his writing. He's,
Hmm.
if your
Mhm.
influences are right, that's a big part of it. Getting those
Yeah.
right influences early on. Yeah,
Oh, I
His
know.
universe was synergy.
it really was. It really
Yeah. That's a good way to put it, Jeannie.
was.
Yep.
So, yeah, like I said, if the guy who could have given you hours of just rapturously talking about Poe, that was Ray. Yeah.
That would have been really neat to have him on
Yeah.
here. Yeah. We talk about it, we joke, and it's like we need to build a time machine
Exactly.
to go meet all of these people.
Yeah, they've been good. That would been something that would have touched my life. That would have been a good universal,
Hmm.
homage for me was would be able to meet these people in person and talk to them and
Yeah.
you know, get their
Well,
perspective on things.
I mean, that was one of the great gifts, that my occupation and the universe gave to me was that I met Ray when the Disney's film version of Something Wicked This Way Comes
Hmm.
Okay.
was released.
Hmm.
Disney. And at the time, I was working at a small newspaper. I was working at a 50,000 circulation newspaper in Kingsport, Tennessee. And I was
Hmm.
the arts editor there. I was the movie critic, the theater critic, the TV critic. I was like one man band. And that movie came out, and the Disney PR people basically said, they would set up an interview with anybody, connected with the movie. And
Hmm.
at the time, I'd read everything Ray Bradbury had written. And I said, I thought there's no chance they're going to give this interview to a 50,000 circulation newspaper in East Tennessee. But I
Hmm.
said, can I talk to Ray Bradbury? And they said, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And they set it up. Yeah.
That's so
Cool.
awesome.
They set it up. And, he loved the way the story came out so much. We started exchanging letters. And then
Yeah.
the HBO did the Ray Bradbury Theater a couple years later. And I met him in person in Phoenix, Arizona. And it just led to this continuous exchange. And then uh, we were going to do a book together at one point.
Oh, wow.
Um, I wanted to do a book on all of Ray's work being adapted into other media, everything, the
Hmm.
Yeah.
movies, TV shows, the comic books, radio scripts, everything. And he loved the idea. And I was going to call it Kaleidoscope because that was the title of one of his famous short stories.
Hmm.
And I thought that's a nice, kaleidoscope. And then the subtitles would be The Many Worlds of Ray Bradbury.
Oh, that would have been, yeah,
So
that
we started work on it. And because I said to him, I said, you don't have to do anything but talk. And Ray loved to talk. And I said, all I want you to do is answer questions.
hmm
Do deep dives on various titles and how they've been adapted. And we only got so far. We had done the Martian Chronicles. We had done Something Wicked This Way Comes. We had done The Illustrated Man.
hmm
So we had gone deep on certain titles, but not nearly all of them because there were so many of them that had been adapted over the years.
Yeah.
We both got busy on other projects. I got busy on Columbo,
Hmm.
and he got busy on something else, and then he suffered the stroke, and we just never revisited it. But I have somewhere in this room boxes and boxes of Ray Bradbury material and taped interviews uh,
Wow.
with him from over the years.
Wow.
Um, and yeah, we did Twilight Zone. We talked Twilight Zone.
Hmm.
So I was able to use some of his thoughts in my Twilight Zone book. I was able to use some of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was one which got that's as I've always said, that if you're fortunate enough to have a nice stack of books, behind that is an equal number of books that never got written or never got
Yeah.
off the ground, you know,
Yeah.
Hmm.
easily that many, and the books that didn't get written, it's not like they were any less good ideas. Some ways they were probably better ideas,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
the timing wasn't right,
Yeah.
whatever, you know. And sometimes you catch up with it, like with the Twilight Zone. You
Yeah.
catch up with it, and the timing all of a sudden, and the right idea, and the timing is right.
Yeah.
So, um, yeah, but like I said, Bradbury would have bent your ear.
Mhm. I
Oh,
would have let him. I'd been like, okay,
oh
just.
yes. Oh,
But thank you, Mark, for joining
Oh,
us as a
yes.
co-host for the
Thank,
Twilight Zone and
pleasure.
Rod
yeah,
Serling.
thank you so much.
I
It's been
hope.
wonderful.
Well, I hope this suits your needs. Like I said, it doesn't matter
Oh,
what
it's
you
been
think. As long
great.
as you're happy, I'm happy.
Oh
That's
Oh
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, we always enjoy talking with you.
well.
exactly.
I would talk like this if the camera wasn't on.
Oh, I
See,
know.
Exactly.
yeah,
And that makes it even
just
better
Yeah, I
because
know.
this is the
Yes.
way that we love because this is the way that a lot of that I learn. And
Mhm.
I,
Yes.
hope a lot of people learn a lot from this type of interview and
Mhm.
well, not really interview, but information gathering.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's what we aim for. So thank you for joining us and
Yes.
helping us, bring Rod and Twilight Zone to life, along with finding out a little bit more information about other people that many people may not realize and know
Hmm.
about Mark Twain, Bradbury, and all the other ones. So hopefully that'll spur them into wanting to find out more.
Well, and by the way, if for those listening, if you ever want to make a pilgrimage for Rod Serling in the Twilight Zone, head for Binghamton, New York, his hometown.
I
Nice.
got to go 2 summers ago and got to see all the things, and it was amazing.
Had
It's
had was the statue there at that point?
No, it came like right after our trip. And so I told my husband, I said, we have got to go back. He goes, we'll get there. We'll get
Yeah,
there because I
the
want
Rod
to see
Serling
that.
Foundation, Memorial Foundation, of which I'm on the board. We unveiled the statue of Rod in Recreation Park where he
Mhm.
played as a little boy. And it's if you made it to Recreation Park, did you ride the carousel with
Yes. Oh, I loved
what
it.
all the scenes from the Twilight Zone are?
Yes. I was like a kid, like looking at all of them, like which one's next? Which one's next?
Well, now you also up on the hill above that is the statue stands up
Okay.
there. So
Okay.
when if you ever get a chance, like I said, it's a wonderful now Recreation Park is just a wonderful tribute. And every year we have Serling Fest, by the way. This year it's in August.
Okay.
So we're expanding to 3 days. We've got several
Oh,
guests
nice.
coming in, and I can give you if anybody wants to, they can go to the Rod Serling Memorial Foundation website
Okay.
to find out more about it. But the dates are in August. It's August 21st through 23rd this year.
Okay, great. No,
Wonderful.
thank you for sharing that with
Yes.
listeners and viewers. Yeah.
You know that we've got a packed 2 or 3 days worth of programs.
Nice. Okay.
Yes.
By all means,
We'll include it on we'll include it with our little taglines that we do for the
Yes.
episode. So people
Yes.
can just click on it and go find it and look
Hmm.
out for more Twilight Zone.
Absolutely.
okay, very
Yes.
good. Well, thanks again for letting me jabber on.
Yes. Well, thank you. We
You're
enjoyed it so
welcome anytime.
much.
Yeah. And on that note, we
We
are
are
Poe out.
out.
There is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.